Ohio might seem like quiet farmland and cozy suburbs, but it holds some of the darkest, most baffling cold cases in the country. People walk out of locked rooms, step off college campuses, or turn a street corner, and simply vanish off the face of the earth. Today, we're counting down the 10 most disturbing Ohio disappearances. If you love deep dives into real-life mysteries, hit that subscribe button and give hype points. Now, lock your doors and let's get into it. Toledo, Ohio, August 4th, 1981. It's a quiet Tuesday morning at a small law firm, and by 10 a.m. something impossible has already happened. A 20-year-old legal secretary named Cindy Anderson has vanished from inside the office. The lights are on. The radio is playing. Her car is still in the parking lot. The heavy wooden door is locked from the inside. And on her desk sits an open paperback book, turned to the only page in the entire novel that describes a woman being taken by force. This is the case of Cindy Anderson. And more than 40 years later, nobody can explain how she walked out of that room. Because as far as anyone can tell, she didn't. Let me set the scene for you. It's August 1981. Toledo is hot, sticky, humid. That thick Midwestern summer air that presses down on you the second you step outside. And the office of attorneys Rabbit and Feldstein is exactly what you'd expect from a small legal practice back then. Typewriters clacking, a pot of coffee brewing in the corner, fluorescent lights, wood paneling, filing cabinets stacked with manila folders. There's a radio playing softly in the background, probably the local AM station. The air conditioning is humming against the heat. This isn't a dangerous place. It's boring. It's professional. It's the kind of office where the most exciting thing that happens all week is somebody spilling their coffee on a deposition. And that's what makes what happened next so unbelievably wrong. Cindy Anderson was 20 years old, and by every single account, she was the model employee. Punctual, thrifty, deeply religious, still lived at home with her parents. She saved every dollar she earned because she was 2 weeks away from quitting the firm to go to a Christian college with her boyfriend. She had plans, real plans, a future mapped out down to the details. But here's the thing. In the months leading up to that Tuesday morning, Cindy had been terrified. She'd been getting phone calls at work, anonymous, menacing, the kind of calls that make you go pale and hang up quickly. They came in over and over again. And it wasn't just the calls. Cindy had been telling her mother about vivid, recurring nightmares, dreams where a strange man broke into her home to abduct her, to hurt her, to harm her. She was so shaken by all of it that her bosses, grown men, seasoned attorneys, became concerned enough that they installed a panic buzzer at her desk. Oh, now, think about that for a second. A law firm in 1981 doesn't install a panic button because things are fine. They installed it because whatever was happening to Cindy had escalated to a point where the professionals around her genuinely believed she was in danger. The day before she disappeared, on Monday, August 3rd, a coworker watched Cindy take another one of those phone calls. She turned white. She became visibly, physically terrified. And when the coworker asked her what was wrong, Cindy wouldn't say. She wouldn't share who was calling. She wouldn't say what they told her. She just shut down. That was the last full day of her life that anyone can account for. Tuesday morning, August 4th. Cindy leaves her parents' house around 8:30 a.m., just like she always does. She drives her white 1980 Chevy Citation to the office. She arrives around 9 a.m. She unlocks the door. She turns on the lights. She flips on the radio. She starts the air conditioning. She sits down at her desk and gets to work. Now, this is important. Because of the harassment, because of the calls, the office had a strict policy. That front door stayed locked. Anyone coming in had to be buzzed in. Cindy would verify who it was through the door, and only then would she let them inside. At around 9:45 a.m., we know she was still there, still working, still fine. By 10 a.m., calls to the firm started going unanswered. That's the window. 15 minutes. Somewhere between 9:45 and 10 a.m., Cindy Anderson disappeared off the face of the earth. Later that morning, the attorneys and other staff started arriving for the day. and they found something they couldn't process. The front door was locked from the inside. They unlocked it, walked in, and the office looked normal. The lights were still burning. The radio was still playing softly, the air conditioning still humming against the August heat. Cindy's white Chevy Citation was still parked out in the lot. Her keys were gone. Her purse was gone. But Cindy was gone too. No signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no blood, no broken windows, nothing knocked off the desk. The panic buzzer she had at her workstation, the one specifically installed because someone was terrorizing her, had never been pressed. And then there was the book. On her desk, sitting there almost like a signature, was a paperback novel. A romance and suspense book she'd been reading on her breaks. It was left face open, face down, holding her place. And when investigators picked it up and read the page she'd left it on, something ice cold crawled up their spines. The book was open to a single scene. Just one. The only violent scene in the entire novel. A passage describing a woman being taken by force with a weapon. Now, let's stop. Let's really look at this, because this is where every logical explanation you can come up with immediately falls apart. Let's start with that door. Because that heavy wooden front door was locked from the inside when coworkers arrived. Take a second and think about what that actually means. If a violent stranger forced his way in, grabbed Cindy, and dragged her out, how did he lock the deadbolt behind him on his way out? You can't lock a deadbolt from the outside without a key. And if he had a key, why did he need to force his way in? Okay, so maybe the intruder was calm. Maybe he had a key. Fine. Then walk me through why Cindy, the girl who was terrified of stalkers, the girl who had a panic button installed at her desk, wouldn't have pressed that button the second she saw him. She had seconds. She had a warning system. She had every reason in the world to be paranoid, and she used none of it. Which means one of two things. Either she knew the person who came in, she trusted them enough to walk over and let them in without pressing that buzzer, or the person was someone with authority, someone in a suit, someone with credentials, someone she wouldn't question, or a third possibility. Whoever came in already had a key. But it gets worse, because if Cindy locked the door herself, say she was hiding from someone, say she was scared, then where did she go? The office wasn't that big. There's no secret passage. There's no back exit she could have vanished through without leaving a trace. She didn't take her car. She didn't take her purse. She just wasn't there. And then, the book. I want you to really sit with this one, because there are only a few explanations, and none of them are comforting. Explanation 1. Coincidence. Cindy just happened to be reading a novel and just happened to have it open to the one violent scene in the whole book, an abduction involving a weapon, at the exact moment she herself was being abducted from her workplace. The odds of that are astronomical, not impossible, but astronomical. Explanation 2. It was a message. Someone, the person who took her, left the book open to that scene deliberately, as a taunt, as a signature, as proof that this was planned, that whoever did this had watched her, knew what she was reading, knew how to leave the perfect chilling calling card. If that's true, we're not looking at a crime of opportunity. We're looking at somebody who wanted investigators to know exactly what had happened and had the nerve to leave a receipt. Explanation 3. And this is the one that really haunts people. Cindy left the book open herself, as a final desperate silent scream for help, knowing what was about to happen, knowing she couldn't reach the buzzer. Maybe someone was standing over her. Maybe she flipped to that page in the seconds before she was taken, praying that somebody smart enough would find it and understand. There is no good version of this story. Investigators had theories, of course. The most persistent one involves a lawyer who worked out of that very same office building, a man named Richard Neller, who was later arrested and imprisoned for running a massive drug trafficking operation with a client of his. The theory goes that Cindy overheard something she wasn't supposed to. Something about the drugs, something about the robberies, something that made her a liability, and she was silenced. It's a strong theory. It fits the timing. It fits the setting. It fits the fact that Cindy might have opened that door for someone she recognized as a fellow professional in the building. But here's the thing. Despite Neller being fully prosecuted and put behind bars, no physical evidence, none, has ever tied him or anyone in his orbit to Cindy's disappearance. No body, no confession, no witnesses, nothing. And then there was the phone call. About a month after Cindy vanished, Toledo police got 2 anonymous calls from a frantic woman. She told them Cindy was being held captive, chained up in a basement, alive. She wouldn't give an address, she wouldn't give a name. She called twice, and then silence. She never called back. The calls couldn't be traced. Was she a witness? A neighbor who heard something through the walls? A woman being held herself? A hoaxer feeding off the news coverage? Nobody knows. Nobody ever will. Some people theorized Cindy just walked away, ran off, started a new life. But that theory falls apart the second you look at it. She left her car. She left her money. She had never touched her savings account. She has never used her social security number since 1981. She was 2 weeks from starting the college dream she'd been saving up for her entire adult life. Why would you throw all of that away on a Tuesday morning without telling a soul? You wouldn't. She didn't. So what really happened in that office between 9:45 and 10 a.m. on August 4th, 1981? We have no idea. We have a locked door, a scared young woman, a panic button that was never pushed, a radio playing to an empty room, a car in the lot, a purse in someone else's hand, and a paperback novel open to a scene that reads like a script for what happened to the girl reading it. More than 40 years have passed. Cindy Anderson would be in her 60s now. Her parents have passed away without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Her boyfriend, the one she was supposed to go to Christian college with, moved on and built a life without her. She walked into a locked professional office on a sunny Tuesday morning in August. She turned on the lights. She turned on the radio. She sat down to read her book. And then she vanished, without a scream, without a struggle, without a trace. The door was still locked when they found it, from the inside. Bristol Township, Ohio, December 15th, 1995. 10 days before Christmas. 5 kids get off a yellow school bus in the late afternoon and walk up to their farmhouse expecting mom and dad. The door is unlocked. A pot of coffee is still sitting on the burner. Their mother's cigarettes are on the counter, right where she always leaves them. Upstairs, the family gun cabinet is standing wide open. The safe is standing wide open. And their parents, the 2 people who were supposed to be inside, have completely vanished. This is the case of John and Shelley Markley. And 30 years later, the only trace anyone has of them is a grainy bank photo of them sitting in their own truck with a stranger in the passenger seat. Let me paint the picture for you. Bristol Township in 1995 is not a place. It's a stretch of frozen farmland in Trumbull County, up near the Pennsylvania border. Rural, isolated, heavy woods, the kind of place where you can stand on your porch, scream at the top of your lungs, and the only thing that answers you is the wind moving through the trees. There are no neighbors within earshot. There are no security cameras on every corner. There's no cell phone in every pocket, because this is 1995. If something goes wrong out here, nobody knows, nobody hears, nobody comes. And on that Tuesday morning, December 15th, everything about the Markley home should have been ordinary. The heater is running. 5 kids, ages 8 to 15, are getting ready for school. Coats, backpacks, lunches. The bus stops at the end of the driveway around 8 a.m., and Shelley puts her youngest, her 8-year-old son, on that bus. She waves him off. That is the last time any of those children will ever see their mother. Let me tell you about John and Shelley Markley. Because to understand how impossible this case is, you have to understand who these people were. John was 36, Shelley was 32. They had been married for years. They'd built a life on that rural property, and they had 5 kids they were absolutely devoted to. This wasn't a couple on the edge of a breakdown. This wasn't a couple flirting with running away. Every single person who knew them says the same thing. Those kids were their entire world. John was meticulous about his stuff, especially his vehicles. He had a 1990 Chevy pickup that he kept in near-perfect condition, and in his garage, under a set of protective tarps, sat his prized possession, a 1978 Corvette. He was the kind of guy who wore his wristwatch every single day and never took it off. Shelley was a chain smoker. She didn't go from one room to the next without her cigarettes, her purse, her ID. That was just her routine. Those items were part of her body. Now, here's a detail that makes the whole thing worse. That very afternoon, December 15th, John and Shelley were supposed to attend a funeral. John's twin sister had just passed away, and the service was that day. Their outfits were laid out on the bed. Everything was ready. So this is not a couple that was checked out. This is not a couple that had one foot out the door. This is a devastated husband getting ready to bury his twin sister and a devoted mother who had just put her 8-year-old on the school bus. Those are not the mental states of people who vanish on purpose. And yet, at 10:30 in the morning, roughly 2 hours after Shelley waved her son off, John's red pickup truck rolls into the drive-thru of a Bank One in Bloomfield, Ohio, about 5 miles from their house. The teller sees John behind the wheel. She sees Shelley squeezed into the middle of the bench seat, and she sees a third person, a man she doesn't recognize, described as slender, dark-haired, sitting in the passenger seat. Shelley signs a check for $1,000. Cash back. The teller processes the transaction. She hands the money over, and the truck pulls away. That surveillance moment, that 6-minute stretch in a bank drive-thru, is the last time anyone in the world saw John and Shelley Markley alive. Fast forward now, 3:30 p.m. School's out. Those 5 kids get off the bus and walk up to the house. The front door is unlocked. That's already strange. They walk inside, and the house is dead quiet. The coffee pot is on, slowly boiling itself dry. Shelley's cigarettes are sitting on the counter, untouched. Her purse is there. Her ID is there. John's wristwatch, the one he obsessively wore, is sitting on a shelf. Not on his wrist. On a shelf. The clothes laid out for the funeral are still on the bed, untouched. The kids call for mom. They call for dad. Nothing. They walk upstairs. And that's where things stop feeling like a normal empty house and start feeling like something out of a nightmare. The gun cabinet in the master bedroom, which was always locked, always, is standing wide open. The small safe in the house is hanging open too, with personal papers scattered across the floor. Somebody went through this house, somebody knew where things were, or somebody made John and Shelley show them. The kids don't know what to do. They eventually call relatives, and when the relatives can't reach John and Shelley either, when the couple never shows up for John's twin sister's funeral, the police get called. The next day, the truck, that same red 1990 Chevy pickup, is found abandoned in the parking lot of a hardware store in Warren, Ohio. About 10 miles from home. It's locked. Nobody's inside. No blood, no struggle, nothing. But the truck is caked in thick mud. Aggressively driven off-road mud. This is a vehicle John kept spotless, and it's been driven somewhere it had no business being. And here's the detail that makes your stomach drop. The protective tarps from John's Corvette, the one sitting in the garage back at the house, are missing. And when police look in the bed of the muddy pickup, there they are, balled up, thrown in. Now let's stop, because we need to talk about why every simple explanation for this case falls apart the second you actually look at it. Let's start with the runaway theory. This is always the first thing investigators consider. Did they take the money and just leave? Skip out on their lives? Come on. Think about that for 1 second. You do not leave a pot of coffee boiling on the stove if you're never coming back. You do not leave your cigarettes on the counter if you're a chain smoker. You do not leave your wristwatch, the one you always wear, sitting on a shelf. You do not lay out clothes for your twin sister's funeral that morning and then just decide right after breakfast to run away forever. You do not abandon 5 children, for a measly $1,000 in cash. That's not enough money to run to Cleveland, let alone start a new life. It's not enough for a hotel room and a bus ticket, and even if you were somehow that cruel and that desperate, you would take your ID, you would take your purse, you would take your watch. You wouldn't leave every meaningful possession you own sitting in an unlocked house waiting for your kids to walk in on it. They didn't run. Okay? So let's talk about the gun cabinet, because this is where the case starts crawling under your skin. That cabinet was locked, always. John was the guy who kept it locked. Only he and Shelley knew where the key was. So if a stranger broke into their home, That stranger wouldn't have known where to find that key. They wouldn't have been able to open that cabinet without smashing the glass. And there was no smashed glass, which means one of two things. Either John himself opened it because he was scared, because someone was in the house, because he wanted to arm himself, or he was forced to open it at gunpoint by someone who already had the drop on him. But if John opened it to arm himself against an intruder, then how does the intruder get the upper hand? How does an intruder walk into a rural farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, force John to open his own gun cabinet, force Shelley to leave her cigarettes and purse behind, and then walk them out of the house, all without a single gunshot, without a single sign of struggle, without knocking over a chair or breaking a lamp? That is not a robbery. That is not a break-in. That is someone who had leverage, somebody who had something over them, or somebody they knew. And that brings us to the bank drive-thru, which is, without a doubt, the strangest piece of this whole case. If a violent stranger has invaded your home, has forced you to open your gun cabinet and your safe, and now wants your money, why does everybody get in the truck and drive to the bank together? Why not just tie John up in the basement, force Shelley to go alone, and threaten to hurt her husband if she doesn't come back? But okay, fine. Maybe the kidnapper doesn't want to split up. Maybe he wants everybody where he can see them. Then explain this. Why does the kidnapper get in the passenger seat, let Shelley sit in the middle, and let John, the victim, the husband, the man he's just terrorized, drive the truck? Think about what that means. John is behind the wheel. John has full control of the vehicle. John could swerve into a telephone pole. John could crash them into another car. John could roll the truck into a ditch. John could pull up to the bank drive-thru window and mouth the words, "Help me," to that teller. John could floor it into the front of the bank. And he does none of those things. He just drives. He pulls up calmly. He sits there while his wife signs a check for exactly $1,000. He waits patiently while the teller counts out the bills, and then he drives away, with his wife squeezed against a stranger. That is not the behavior of a man being kidnapped, or if it is the behavior of a man who has been told something so terrifying, a threat against his kids, a threat against someone else, that he is willing to cooperate through his own demise. And why $1,000? If this was a professional robbery, if this was somebody who knew the Markleys had a safe in their bedroom, why not clean them out? Why not demand 5, 10, 20,000? Why does the whole day end in this weird, small, specific number? Some people think the answer is that this wasn't random. There was a former employee named Stephen Durst who, months later, contacted the family claiming to be holding them hostage and demanding a $10,000 ransom. Police set up a sting, and Durst walked right into it. He got arrested. But here's the thing. Durst also told people at various points that the Markleys owed him exactly $1,000. That number. That very specific number. Police eventually concluded Durst was just an opportunistic scumbag trying to cash in on a family's grief, not the actual killer. But that number, $1,000, is a coincidence that just refuses to sit still. And then there are those Corvette tarps, thrown into the bed of a muddy pickup that had been driven somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. If you know anything about how bodies get moved, you know what tarps are for. Massive searches followed, helicopters, hundreds of volunteers, dive teams pulling apart Mosquito Lake and the Nelson Ledges quarry. Nothing, not a shoe, not a tooth, not a bone, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. Those 5 Markley kids grew up without their parents. They had to figure out how to bury family members without ever burying their own mom and dad. They had to fall asleep every night for 30 years, wondering if the last thing their parents felt was fear, whether they were made to beg, whether they knew in that last minute that they were never going home to their kids. We know almost nothing about that Tuesday, but we do know how it ends. It ends with a red pickup truck pulling out of a bank drive-thru at 10:36 a.m. John behind the wheel. Shelley squeezed into the middle seat. A slender, dark-haired stranger in the passenger seat. $1,000 in cash on the dashboard. And an entire winter afternoon of rural Ohio stretched out in front of them. Nobody knows where that truck went. Nobody knows who that man was. Nobody knows what he said to them, or what he did to them, or where their bodies are. They just drove away, and they never came back. Marysville, Ohio. Just after midnight, June 29, 2001. A 29-year-old single mom named Patty Adkins is about to do the strangest, most trusting thing she's ever done in her life. She's going to walk across a packed factory parking lot, climb into the bed of a man's pickup truck, pull a canvas cover over her head, and lie down in total darkness. And she's going to do it willingly. Because she thinks the man behind the wheel is the love of her life. And she thinks she's on her way to a week-long vacation in Canada. She is not on her way to Canada. Nobody knows where she is on her way to. Because after that truck rolls out of the Honda plant, Patty Adkins is never seen again. This is the case of Patty Adkins. And it's the story of how you commit the perfect crime by getting your victim to hide herself. Let me set the scene. Because to understand this case, you have to understand what a Honda of America manufacturing plant looks like at midnight on a Friday. Marysville, Ohio. It's summer 2001. The plant is one of the largest auto factories in the country, a sprawling industrial monster of assembly lines, welding sparks, robot arms, and the low, endless roar of machinery. It runs 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, and when a shift ends, it does not end quietly. Thousands of tired workers pour out of the doors at once, grease-stained uniforms, half-drunk coffee cups, cigarettes lit before their feet hit the pavement. They flood into a parking lot so massive it looks like a small city. Rows and rows of pickup trucks, Honda Civics, work vans, all lit up under those flat, ugly fluorescent light poles that make everyone's face look like a mugshot. That is a lot of witnesses. Hundreds of them, walking to their cars, cutting through rows, waving at friends, talking about their kids, their weekends, their bills. And on this particular night, June 29, 2001, a woman named Patty Adkins was going to walk through that crowd, get into a truck, and disappear from the face of the earth without a single person seeing a thing. Here's who Patty was, 29 years old, a single mother. She had one daughter, Michaelie, who was 7 years old, and by every account, that little girl was Patty's entire universe. Patty had been at the Honda plant for 10 years, and she had worked her way up from the assembly line into a supervisor position. That is not easy. That takes a decade of discipline, showing up on time, hitting your numbers, running your line. Patty was reliable, she was thrifty, she was responsible, but Patty had a secret, and it was a big one. For a while now, Patty had been in a relationship with a married co-worker at the plant, a guy she worked with, a guy who told her over and over that he was going to leave his wife, that they had a future, that he was hers. And because she believed him, because she loved him, Patty had been quietly, systematically giving him money. Not a little money, a lot of money. Investigators would later trace the amount she had loaned him, more than $90,000. Let that number sit for a second. A single mom working a factory job, funneling $90,000 to a married man. That's her savings. That's her retirement. That's a chunk of her daughter's future. Gone. Handed to a guy who was still going home to his wife every night. Now, in the days leading up to June 29th, Patty told her sister some very specific things. She said she was going on a vacation, a whole week, off the grid, up to a remote part of Canada, with her boyfriend. She said she wouldn't have cell service, so nobody should worry if they didn't hear from her. And she signed off, the last conversation her sister ever had with her, with, "Kiss, kiss, love you, sis." But here's the part that will make your skin crawl. Because the boyfriend was married, and because his co-workers might see them leaving together and start asking questions, Patty and this man had cooked up a plan. A stupid movie plot, absolutely bananas plan. Patty was going to hide. Specifically, she was going to lie down flat in the bed of his pickup truck and pull his tonneau cover, a canvas sheet that stretches over the truck bed, over the top of her. Total darkness. She'd stay in there until they were clear of the plant, safely on the road, out of sight of anyone from work. That was the plan. Around midnight on June 29th, Patty clocks out of her second shift. She walks to her own car in the lot. She leaves her Honda work uniform inside. And then, based on where the physical evidence eventually points, she walks over to her boyfriend's pickup truck. She climbs into the bed. She pulls the cover over herself. She lies down in the dark. She thinks she's going to Canada. A week goes by. July 8th arrives. This is the day she's supposed to come home and pick up her daughter. Michaelie is waiting for her mom. Mom doesn't come. The family panics. They report her missing. And police start doing what police do. They start with the last people who saw her. They go to the boyfriend, the married co-worker, and they ask him about Patty Adkins. He tells them he barely knew her. Now, this is where it gets strange. He says they were just co-workers, casual acquaintances. He denies the affair completely. He denies there was ever any Canada trip. He denies the plan. He denies the $90,000. He denies everything. The problem is, the story starts falling apart almost immediately. Because when police get a search warrant and go through his house, they find things. A birthday card signed by Patty, a t-shirt Patty had bought him, a cell phone that Patty had paid for and given him, hidden inside his home. You do not hide a birthday card from an acquaintance. They then get a look at his truck. The truck that Patty was supposedly going to hide in. And here's a very interesting fact. The truck still had the metal frame of the tonneau cover attached to the bed, but the actual canvas cover was gone. It had been removed. Police eventually located it hidden somewhere else on his property. He had ripped the cover off his own truck and hidden it after Patty disappeared. When they analyzed that canvas, they found two things. The first was a tiny microscopic speck of DNA, too small for the DNA testing technology of 2001 to conclusively match to Patty. But the second thing they could match, a single strand of cat hair. And that cat hair was a direct match to Patty's white cat at home. Now, let's stop. Let's stop and really think about what all of this means, because when you actually walk through the logic, this case gets more infuriating by the minute. Let's start with the parking lot. The Honda plant at midnight is one of the worst possible places on earth to commit a violent abduction. There are hundreds of witnesses, there are floodlights, there are security cameras on some of the entrances. There are co-workers whose whole social life is built around watching who leaves with who. If somebody grabs Patty in that parking lot, if there's a scream, a scuffle, a chase, a dozen people see it. Somebody calls it in. But that's not what happened. There was no scream, there was no scuffle, there was no witness, because Patty wasn't attacked. Patty hid herself. That is the psychological horror at the center of this case. This isn't a stranger with a knife. This isn't a masked man dragging her into a van. This is a woman who trusted a man so completely that she voluntarily lay down in the pitch-dark bed of his truck, wrapped a canvas over her own body, and waited for him to drive her wherever he wanted to take her. She solved his logistical problem for him. Now, the boyfriend. Let's look at his story. He claims they were just co-workers, just casual acquaintances. Really? You loan casual acquaintances $90,000? You empty your accounts for a woman you barely know? A single mom on a factory salary hands you her entire savings and you barely recognize her name? That doesn't happen. That is not how humans behave. And if you truly barely knew her, then here's a question. How did her blood end up in the bed of your truck? How did her cat's hair, from her house, from her personal life, from her private world, end up on the cover of a pickup truck belonging to a stranger? There's only one way that happens. Patty got into that truck, and she had been at that man's house enough for her cat's hair to be on her clothes. And here's the really damning one. If she never got in your truck, if the affair never existed, if the Canada trip was a fantasy, why did you tear the tonneau cover off your truck the second she vanished, hide it on your property, and go out and buy a brand new one? Innocent people don't do that. Innocent people don't quietly dispose of the exact piece of evidence a missing woman's family says she was supposed to hide under. Innocent people go, "That's ridiculous. Here's my truck. Look through it. I have nothing to hide." So how does this guy walk away from all of it? He walked because of one thing: time. His alibi was airtight if you look at it a certain way. He clocked out at midnight. He gave a different coworker a ride home. He got to his own house by 2:30 a.m. And he was with his wife and kids for the entire following week. So from midnight to 2:30 a.m., he had a 2.5-hour window. That's it. That is the total time he had to allegedly get Patty out of the parking lot, drive somewhere, end her life, conceal the evidence, clean the truck, and get home to his wife looking normal. Prosecutors looked at that window. They looked at the lack of a body. They looked at the tiny speck of blood that couldn't be conclusively DNA matched with 2001 technology. And they made a call. They didn't think they could get a jury to convict a man of murder without a body, without a crime scene, and with a tight alibi that made every hour of the timeline a puzzle piece. So a grand jury never returned an indictment. And the boyfriend went on with his life. Patty's daughter, Michael, grew up without her mother. Patty's sister spent decades knowing exactly who she believes did this and being unable to do anything about it. And somewhere out there, in a field, in a wood line, in a place a man with 2.5 hours could reach and get back from, is Patty Adkins. I want you to think about her last conscious moments, because that's what this case really is. Patty is lying flat on her back in the bed of a truck. It is dark. The canvas cover is inches from her face. She can hear the engine idling. She can hear the muffled voices of co-workers walking past. She's probably smiling, because she thinks in a few minutes they'll be on the highway. In a few hours, they'll be in a hotel room. In a few days, they'll be somewhere quiet. Together, alone, finally, a real couple out from under the shadow of his marriage. The engine shifts. The truck starts moving. She feels the vibration under her back. She hears the parking lot noise fade away. She hears the road under the tires. And she has no idea. She has absolutely no idea that the man behind the wheel is not driving her to Canada. He's driving her to the place where he is going to make sure she can never ask for her $90,000 back. That was the summer of 2001. 25 years later, Patty Adkins is still missing. The prime suspect has never spent a night in jail for this case, and nobody, not her family, not her daughter, not the investigators who worked it for 2 decades, has ever gotten to know what she saw when the tonneau cover finally came off. Oxford, Ohio, April 19, 1953. It's late on a Sunday night. Snow is falling on a college campus in the middle of April, and a 19-year-old sophomore named Ronald Tamman is in his dorm room studying for a psychology test. Around 10:30 p.m., his roommate walks back into the room. The overhead lights are on. The radio's playing softly. Ron's psychology textbook is sitting open on the desk, still turned to the page he was reading. His wallet is there. His car keys are there. His heavy winter coat is hanging up. Everything a young man needs to walk out into a snowstorm is still in that room. Everything except Ron. This is the case of Ronald Tamman, and more than 70 years later, he is still known on that campus by one name, the Phantom of Oxford. Let me set the scene, because this is one of the most classically American settings a mystery could ever unfold in. Miami University in 1953 is the postcard version of college. Red brick buildings, ivy on the walls, boys in wool sweaters and Letterman jackets, girls in bobby socks, big band music leaking out of every window. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody's got a nickname. It's the height of the Eisenhower years. The country's still catching its breath from World War II, and the Cold War is starting to hum in the background of every conversation. And Fisher Hall is the crown jewel of this whole vibe. Now, Fisher Hall was not just a dorm. It was a huge, 4-story Gothic-looking castle of a building. Dark stone, arched windows, the whole 9 yards. It had originally been built as a sanitarium, an actual old-timey mental hospital, before the university took it over and turned it into student housing. So already, we're starting with a building that has a little bit of a strange energy baked into the walls. On the night of April 19th, that dorm is fully alive. Typewriters clacking behind closed doors, radios playing on every floor, guys yelling down the hallways about a wrestling match or a girl or their upcoming finals. It's warm inside, it's loud, it's safe. And outside, well, outside is doing something weird. It's April, it should be spring. But a late-season snowstorm is barreling through southwest Ohio, wind, ice, snow, temperatures dropping well below freezing. The kind of weather where you don't go outside unless you absolutely have to, and when you do, you bundle up. That's the setting. And now, let's meet Ron. Ronald Henry Tamman Jr. was 19 years old, from Maple Heights, Ohio, and by every single account, he was the golden boy. Tall, muscular, good-looking. He was a varsity wrestler for the university, so we're talking about a young man in serious physical shape. He was also musical. He played string bass in the university's popular dance band, the Campus Owls, which meant on weekends you'd find him up on stage in a suit playing gigs for other students. He was in Delta Tau Delta fraternity. He had close friends. He was reliable enough that the university had made him a resident advisor for Fisher Hall. Ron had no enemies, no debts, no trouble with girls, no fights, no drug problems, no signs of depression. He wasn't a kid who ran off. He wasn't a kid who partied too hard. He was the guy other guys' parents wanted their sons to be. And on the night of April 19th, he was doing exactly what a good sophomore does on a Sunday night. He was in his room, at his desk, cracking open a psychology textbook, studying for a test. Around 8 p.m., Ron gets up from his desk. He walks over to his bed, and he discovers that somebody, at some point that day, had played a classic old-school dorm prank on him. There was a dead fish in his bed. Now, irritating, sure. But this is 1953. Guys were doing weirder stuff to each other all the time. Ron just wants clean sheets. So he heads down the hall to the dorm's manager and asks for a fresh set. The manager hands him the sheets. That manager becomes the last person on planet Earth who can confirm with certainty that they saw Ronald Tamman alive. Ron walks the sheets back toward his room. It's around 8:30 p.m. Fast forward 2 hours, 10:30 p.m. Ron's roommate walks in, and the room stops him cold. The overhead lights are on, burning. The radio is playing softly. Ron's psychology book is sitting open on the desk, right where he left it. And Ron is nowhere. But the details in that room are the part that will keep you up at night. His wallet is there. His car keys are there. His heavy winter coat is still hanging up. Outside, the temperature has plummeted. Snow is falling. Wind is howling. And the boy who was supposed to be in that chair, in that light, listening to that radio, is gone. Now, let's stop. Because this is where the case starts refusing to make sense. Let's talk about the theories. Theory 1, Ronald ran away. Just packed it in. Walked out of his life, started over somewhere else. It's the first theory police always chase for a young missing person. But wait. Let's look at the room. Because that room is not the room of a boy running away. That room is the room of a boy who thought he was coming back in about 30 seconds. You do not stage your own disappearance and leave the overhead lights blazing behind you. You do not leave the radio on. You do not leave your psychology textbook cracked open to the page you were studying. Mid-chapter, mid-thought, mid-life. If you're planning to vanish, you at least take your wallet. You take your car keys. You take enough money to get to a bus station. Ron took none of it. And the coat. My God, the coat, and it is snowing outside. There is a real active snowstorm hammering the campus. The temperature has dropped below freezing, and Ron's heavy winter coat is hanging in that room, exactly where he left it. You don't walk out into a snowstorm in a shirt and pants because you're starting a new life. You don't do it because you're upset. You don't even do it because you had a breakdown. Basic survival instinct kicks in. You grab a coat. Ron didn't grab anything, so okay, he didn't run. Then, theory 2, foul play. Somebody in the dorm attacked him. Well, let's look at that. Ron was a wrestler, a varsity athlete. This is a 19-year-old kid who spent his afternoons on a mat learning how to physically dominate other men. He was strong, he was in shape. He was not the kind of guy who quietly gets dragged out of a dormitory. And this dorm, Fisher Hall, was full. Students everywhere, doors open, radios blaring, guys walking to and from the bathroom. The floors were tile, so every footstep echoed. How does anybody grab this specific young man on this specific night out of this specific hallway and get him out of the building without a single person hearing anything? No shout, no scuffle, no thump against a wall, no dropped sheets, nothing. The room itself is undisturbed. No broken lamp, no overturned chair, no sign that anything violent happened inside it. He just stopped existing. Now, here's where the case takes a hard turn into somewhere very strange. Because there is one confirmed sighting after that dorm room went quiet. Early the next morning, in a rural town called 7 Mile, about 10 or 12 miles from campus, a woman answers a knock at her door. Standing on her porch is a young man who matches Ronald Taman's description exactly. Tall, athletic, same face, same build, but he looks wrong. He looks dazed. He looks confused. His eyes aren't focusing, and there's a streak of dirt across his face, like he fell somewhere and never wiped it off. He asks her, very calmly, very politely, for directions to the nearest bus stop. She gives them to him. He turns around, he walks away. And then Ronald Taman is gone from the record of humanity forever. Now, let me throw one more thing at you. Because this next part is the piece that, decades later, made investigators sit up and go, wait, what? 5 months before Ron disappeared, 5 months, he walked into the Butler County Coroner's office, not the campus health center, not a doctor's office, the coroner, the place where the deceased are taken. He asked for a blood typing test. He wanted to know his own blood type. The coroner at the time, a Dr. Boone, was baffled. He told investigators, decades later, that in his 35 years of practice, Ronald Taman was the only living person who ever walked into his office and asked for a blood type test. Why? Why would a healthy 19-year-old college athlete bypass every normal medical option and specifically go to the county morgue to find out his own blood type? What situation was he preparing for where knowing that information from a coroner specifically? Nobody has ever been able to answer that. And then there's the FBI, which is a whole other layer. The FBI got involved in Ronald Taman's missing persons case almost immediately, back in 1953. They cited selective service and draft implications as the reason. Fine. But then they stayed involved for decades, and in 2008, they destroyed portions of Ronald Taman's file. Researchers who've been digging into this case for the better part of 40 years say the government is still sitting on classified information about what happened to Ron, which of course has fueled the biggest and wildest theory of them all, that Ronald Taman didn't wander off, didn't run away, and didn't meet foul play, that he was recruited or grabbed and absorbed into some black box Cold War intelligence program. And I know how that sounds. I do. But look at what's on the desk. That psychology textbook that Ron left open, mid-chapter, the chapter he was reading, Memory and Hypnosis. Now, this is where a responsible storyteller has to pump the brakes, because there is zero, and I mean zero, physical evidence tying Ronald Taman to the CIA, or to MK Ultra, or to any government program. Everything in that theory is built on secrecy, on the fact that certain records don't exist and other records got destroyed. It's a theory that's shaped like a shadow, but even without the spy stuff, the plain, flat, boring facts of this case do not make sense. A healthy, popular, athletic 19-year-old walked down a hallway to get fresh bedsheets on a snowy Sunday night in April of 1953. He came back to his room. He put the sheets down. He started reading his textbook. He left the light on. He left the radio playing. He left his coat and wallet and keys in the room where they belonged. And then, without a scream, without a scuffle, without a witness, without a coat, he stepped out of that room and stepped out of the world. Fisher Hall stood there for another 25 years, full of ghost stories about the boy who vanished from the second floor. When the university finally demolished the building in 1978, workers sifted through every piece of rubble looking for bones, for teeth, for anything. They found nothing. The Butler County coroner who did that strange blood test is gone. Ron's roommate is gone. Most of the friends who saw him that day are gone. The FBI is still not talking. And Ronald Taman? Ronald Taman is still 19 years old, somewhere in the mind of the country that lost him. Still tall, still smiling, still walking down a snowy dormitory hallway with a fresh set of bedsheets in his arms, still one step from his room, still one step from a life he never got to live, and still one step from wherever it was that took him. Columbus, Ohio, 4:10 in the morning, February 24th, 2019. A 29-year-old husband and father named Tyler Davis is on the phone with his wife. He's been out walking in the freezing cold for close to an hour, disoriented, trying to find his way back to their hotel room. And on this call, his voice is calm. He tells her very clearly, "I'm in the woods behind the hotel. I can see the Hilton. I'm walking toward it now. I'll be there in 5 minutes." 1 minute later, at 4:11 a.m., he calls her one more time. The call connects. There are exactly 4 seconds of dead silence, no struggle, no voice, nothing. Then the line drops. And Tyler Davis's phone never turns back on again. This is the case of Tyler Davis. And to this day, nobody can explain how a man can be a 5-minute walk from his hotel room in a heavily surveilled modern city and simply cease to exist between one phone call and the next. Let me paint the picture for you. Because the setting of this case is important, and it's important in a way that most true crime settings aren't. Easton Town Center in Columbus is not the woods. It is not remote. It is not the middle of nowhere. It is a massive upscale outdoor shopping district, luxury boutiques, chain restaurants, a movie theater, high-end apartments, the Hilton Hotel, neon signs, streetlights, concrete, security cameras on every corner of every building. This is 2019, mind you. This is the era of your phone tracking every step you take, your car tracking every mile you drive, and a camera watching pretty much every commercial doorway in the country. Now, sprinkled around the edges of that shiny commercial district are a few dark spots. Small patches of trees, some retention ponds, those little man-made lakes that shopping centers build for drainage, some marshy strips between corporate office parks. Nothing you could really call woods, nothing you could call wilderness, just leftover pieces of undeveloped land jammed in between the mall and the highway. And it's freezing. February in Ohio. That deep, dry, mean cold that gets under your jacket and stays there. That's where Tyler Davis was. Now, who was Tyler? Because this matters too. Tyler was 29 years old, from Wilmington, Ohio. He was a husband. He was a father to a young son. He had driven 3 hours up to Columbus that weekend with his wife Brittany to celebrate her 23rd birthday. A little getaway, just the two of them, plus one of Tyler's college friends who was going to meet them for a night out. Tyler was not a party guy. His wife has described him as sarcastic, funny, deeply loyal, kind of an introvert. He was a homebody. He was an avid gamer. He was the kind of guy, and I love this detail, who had been wearing the same pair of shoes since college. That's who Tyler was. He was not a wild man. He was not an outdoorsman. He was not the guy who takes off on solo adventures. If you asked his wife, she'd tell you Tyler didn't go for a walk in the woods. Tyler went for a walk to the couch. There's also one detail about his physical state on that trip that we have to talk about. Tyler had been working brutal 10 to 12-hour night shifts for 6 days in a row before this trip. 6 days. No days off. He was, by every account, running on fumes. Deep bone-level sleep deprivation. Add a few drinks on top of that, and you have a man whose brain is not firing on all cylinders. Here's how the night unfolds. Tyler, Brittany, and Tyler's college buddy Sean go out. They have drinks at a couple of bars. They take an Uber to a gentleman's club. Around 3 a.m., they call another Uber to take them back to the Hilton. Tyler falls dead asleep in the Uber, fully passed out. At 3:18 a.m., the Uber pulls up to the Hilton, and this is where things start to go sideways. Tyler wakes up disoriented, really disoriented. He doesn't recognize the hotel. He becomes convinced that the driver has dropped them off at the wrong place. He gets agitated. He gets out of the car and storms off into the night, insisting he can find their real hotel. Brittany, exhausted, goes up to the room to plug her dead phone into the charger. Sean goes after Tyler. A few minutes later, Sean comes back to the hotel alone. He tells Brittany that Tyler just needs to walk off some steam and will be back shortly. At 3:37 a.m., Tyler calls Brittany. He sounds fine. He sounds sober-ish. He sounds coherent. He apologizes for how he acted. He says he's just walking around the block. He'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, sure. This sounds like a story that ends with the guy walking back into the hotel lobby, sheepish, ordering room service and going to bed. But it doesn't end that way. At 3:51 a.m., Tyler pulls out his phone. and digital forensics later shows exactly what he searched. He typed the words Easton Suites into Google Maps. Easton Suites, not the Hilton. He was still convinced he was staying somewhere else. 2 minutes after that, at 3:53 a.m., Tyler's cell phone pings a tower near Abbott Labs. Now, Abbott Labs is a corporate campus. It is a full mile from the Hilton. In about 15 minutes of walking, in the freezing dark, in a state of exhausted intoxication, Tyler had somehow gotten himself a mile away from where his wife was waiting. And then, at 4:10 a.m., that final coherent call. Tyler tells Brittany, "I'm in the woods behind the hotel. I can see the Hilton. I'm walking toward it now. I'll be there in 5 minutes." 5 minutes. At 4:11 a.m., one more call, 4 seconds of silence. Then it drops. Tyler Davis is never heard from again. His phone never turns on again. And he never walks back into that hotel. Now let's stop, because we need to talk about how deeply, structurally, insanely wrong this case is. Let's start with the runaway theory, which every time somebody vanishes is theory number one that police reach for. Could Tyler have just decided to walk out on his life? Fake his own disappearance, start over somewhere else? Come on, look at what he was actually doing in his final hour. He was calling his wife, repeatedly. He was apologizing for being a jerk in the parking lot. He was Google mapping directions to a hotel. He was giving her ETAs. He was updating her on where he was. Nobody escaping their life calls their wife 3 times to give her a running progress report. Nobody about to fake their own death Googles Easton Suites so they can find their way back to bed. Tyler was not running away. Tyler was trying, in the fog of sleep deprivation and alcohol, to get back to his wife and get some sleep. Okay, so he wasn't running. Then, let's look at the theory that police mostly landed on, the exposure and accident theory. The idea is that Tyler, drunk and exhausted and confused, wandered into one of those small patches of woods on the edge of the Easton Commercial District, slipped into a retention pond, fell down in the freezing cold, died of hypothermia, just never got up. And on the surface, that seems like it should be the answer. He was drunk. He was disoriented. He was in shirt sleeves in February. But here's where the theory falls apart. Easton is not the woods. Easton is a concrete jungle. Those little patches of trees he could have wandered into are not vast, unmapped wilderness. They're small, isolated pieces of landscaping wedged between buildings and parking lots and highways. If you fall down in one of them, you are visible from the road. You are visible from a parking lot. You are visible from a security camera. And after Tyler vanished, police did not do a small search. They did a massive one. Dive teams dredged the retention ponds. Cadaver dogs went through every wooded strip in a huge radius. Drones searched from above. Volunteers walked the ground. They combed every acre of that immediate area with the kind of thoroughness that would find a body if a body was there to find. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no phone, not a shoe, not a jacket zipper, not a scrap of anything. Now, let's talk about the cameras, because this is the thing that really breaks the case. We are talking about 2019. Easton Town Center is one of the most surveilled commercial districts in the state of Ohio. There are cameras on every hotel entrance, every mall entrance, every parking garage, every corporate building, every store. Security footage, in fact, does exist of Tyler after he left the Hilton. Cameras caught him walking briskly and purposefully through a condominium complex alone. Alone. Nobody following him, nobody talking to him, just Tyler, marching straight through the frame and back out of it. So how does a man walking around a modern American city for 45 minutes, making phone calls, searching maps, pinging cell towers, how does he only appear on cameras once? How does he not get picked up by another dozen cameras between the condominium complex and the Hilton? He doesn't vanish because he stops walking. He vanishes because he stops being anywhere a camera is pointed. And then there's the last real puzzle piece, the geographic impossibility of his own words. At 3:53 a.m., his phone pings a tower near Abbott Labs. That is a full mile from the Hilton. At 4:10 a.m., 17 minutes later, he tells his wife he is standing in the woods and can see the hotel. Now, 17 minutes to walk a mile is doable if you're moving fast and know where you're going. But Tyler was intoxicated. Tyler was sleep-deprived. Tyler had just Googled directions to the wrong hotel. And at Abbott Labs, you cannot see the Hilton. The line of sight is blocked by corporate buildings. So on that final call, one of three things is true. Either Tyler somehow covered a mile of ground in the dark in 17 minutes and had somehow found a specific angle where he could see the hotel. Possible, but tight. Or he was looking at a completely different building that he mistook for the Hilton in his disoriented state, which is genuinely scary because that means he had no idea where he actually was. Or, and this is the theory that keeps his family up at night, he wasn't walking anymore. He had been picked up. He was in a vehicle, and whoever was driving it was telling him he'd be at the Hilton in 5 minutes. We don't know which one it is. Then those final 4 seconds, that call at 4:11 a.m. It connects. It sits there, live for 4 whole seconds, and on the other end, nothing. No wind sound, no footsteps, no voice, no struggle. Just 4 seconds of ambient silence, and then the call ends. That is not a phone dying. A dying phone glitches, it cuts out, it drops mid-word. That is somebody's phone being turned off, or shattered, or dropped into water. Deliberately. Now, Tyler's wife Brittany has to live with the fact that she was on the last phone call. She was listening to those 4 seconds of silence. She was on the other end of the line when whatever happened, happened. And she never got to say goodbye. She just got a dial tone. Massive searches followed, bloodhounds, dive teams, drones, volunteers, reward money, years of investigation, and to this day, nothing. No body, no phone, no answers. Tyler Davis stepped outside a hotel for a few minutes of fresh air on his wife's birthday weekend. He was on the phone with her. He was trying to find his way home. He was 5 minutes away. That was almost 7 years ago. And he is still 5 minutes away, and he is still not home. Chillicothe, Ohio. Between May of 2014 and May of 2015, in a small city of just over 21,000 people, 6 women vanished. Not in different corners of the country, not spread out over decades, in one 13-month window, in one town, in one social circle, 6 women. 4 of them were eventually found dead. 2 of them are still missing today. And when it was over, when the disappearances suddenly, abruptly stopped, the local police told the community that this was probably just a string of separate tragedies. Bad luck. Troubled lives catching up with troubled women. This is the case of the Chillicothe 6. And I want you to decide for yourself whether the math on that explanation actually adds up. Let me set the scene. Because to understand this case, you have to understand the town. Chillicothe sits in the Scioto Valley, tucked into the foothills of Appalachia. It was Ohio's first state capital. It's got old brick buildings, a downtown square, church steeples. On paper, it sounds like a postcard. But in 2014, Chillicothe was ground zero for something ugly. The opioid epidemic was tearing through southern Ohio like a fire, and Chillicothe was directly on U.S. Route 23, a major highway that runs from Detroit down through the state, and one that federal investigators had already nicknamed the Hillbilly Highway because of the amount of narcotics and human trafficking that moved up and down it. So you've got a small, close-knit town where everybody knows everybody. You've got a drug crisis chewing through families. You've got budget motels along the highway. You've got dark riverbanks along the Scioto and Paint Creek. You've got rural woodland stretching for miles between farm roads. And you've got a vulnerable population of women, many of them struggling with addiction, some of them engaging in desperate survival activities to feed that addiction, moving through those places without much protection from anyone. Then, in May of 2014, the missing posters start going up. And they do not stop. Let me introduce you to the 6. Charlotte Trego was 27. She was a mother of 2. She was in the grip of a bad addiction, but her family was clear about one thing. Charlotte always came back. She'd disappear for a few days, sure, but she always eventually called her mom. Always. That was her baseline. Tameka Lynch was 30. A mother of 3. She talked to her family every single day like clockwork, and her family, this detail matters, was very specific about the fact that Tameka was terrified of water. She would not go near a river. Wanda Lemons was 37, a mother of 5. She traveled sometimes, but she stayed in touch with her kids constantly. Shasta Himmelrich was 20, the youngest of the group, and Shasta was pregnant. She had just spent Christmas Day 2014 with her family, thrilled about becoming a mother, actively planning her baby's future. Timberly Clater was 38, a mother of 5, a grandmother, deeply entrenched in the local scene but fiercely protective of her family. And Tiffany Sayre was 26, a mother of 2, social, known around town. Before we go one step further, I want you to hold on to something, because when this case unfolds, you are going to hear a lot of people, including some early investigators, describe these women as troubled and their deaths as high-risk lifestyle outcomes. And that framing does the work of making them disappear a second time. Every single one of these women was a daughter. Every single one was a mother. Every single one had people at home who loved them, who watched the news every night, who checked their phones 100 times a day hoping for a call. They were not a category. They were 6 specific people. Now, let's tell you what happened to them. May 3rd, 2014. Charlotte Trego is evicted from her apartment. She leaves on foot. She tells a friend she's leaving town. She's never seen again. 2 weeks later, May 16th, Tameka Lynch, the woman who was scared of water, the woman who called her family every day, disappears. Her family reports her missing when the daily phone calls suddenly stop. 8 days after that, Tameka's body is found on a sandbar in Paint Creek, stripped of her clothing. Now, this is where it gets strange, because the coroner ruled that Tameka had died of a drug overdose before she entered the water. She was already dead when someone put her in that creek. Fall of 2014. Wanda Lemons vanishes. She mentions to somebody she might be going to Texas with a truck driver. She never comes back. Her body has never been recovered. Christmas of 2014. Shasta Himmelrich spends Christmas Day with her family, glowing about her pregnancy. The next morning, December 26th, a gas station camera picks her up alone at 3:15 a.m. in a nearby town. A few hours later, her car is found abandoned near a bridge over the Scioto River, doors wide open, battery dead, her cell phone inside, her ATM card inside. Items suggesting drug use and a staged scene were left behind. Her shoes placed neatly next to the bridge. A week later, her body is pulled from the river. The coroner ruled that she intentionally took her own life. A pregnant 20-year-old, ecstatic about becoming a mother, ruled a self-inflicted death on a case where somebody had staged the scene like a movie set. We'll come back to that. May of 2015. Timberly Clater is found dead in tall weeds beside U.S. Route 23 in a little community called Masseyville. She suffered fatal gunshot wounds. 9 days after Clater, Tiffany Sayre vanishes from the Chillicothe Inn, a local motel with a well-known reputation for illicit activities. She was last seen there with 2 men. A month later, Tiffany's body is discovered in a culvert in Highland County. She has been wrapped in a white sheet. She's been secured with duct tape. And here's a detail that should freeze the blood in your veins. That culvert in Highland County is only a few miles from where Tameka Lynch's body had been dumped a year earlier. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stops. After Tiffany Sayre, no more women go missing in that specific way in Chillicothe. The clock just runs out. Now, let's stop. Let's really stop. Because there is an official version of this story, and we need to talk about how it doesn't add up. For a long time, the party line from certain corners of law enforcement was that these deaths were not connected, that these were just separate tragic events, overdoses, self-inflicted, a single homicide by a boyfriend, that there was no serial killer, no ring, no coordinated predator, just a bunch of women whose troubled histories caught up with them. Okay, let's actually run the numbers on that. Chillicothe has just over 21,000 residents. In a city that size, having 6 women who all knew each other or knew the same people or frequented the same motels and rehabs vanish or turn up dead in bodies of water in rural culverts inside a 13-month window, that is not statistically normal. It is not even statistically improbable. It is statistically absurd. If you took every small town in America and asked how many of them experience a cluster like that, the answer is a rounding error. This isn't the flu going around. Women don't randomly all decide to walk into rivers within 13 months of each other. 6 mothers do not accidentally end up in creeks and culverts across 2 counties by coincidence. That is not what tragedy at scale looks like. That is what pattern looks like. And now let's talk about the water, because the water is the piece that really cuts through the unrelated tragedy argument. Tamika Lynch was terrified of the water. Family said she wouldn't go near it. She died of an overdose before entering Paint Creek, so somebody moved her body into that creek after she was already dead. That is not an accident. That is disposal. Shasta Himmelrich's scene, the shoes placed neatly, the phone left behind, the doors wide open, the razor blades with a little bit of blood, the fact that she was pregnant and excited about it. That scene reads like it was arranged. It reads like someone wanted it to look like a self-inflicted death, and it was accepted as one. Tiffany Sayre, wrapped in a sheet, taped up, dumped in a rural culvert near where Tamika had been dumped a year earlier. That is not a coincidence of geography. That is somebody who knew the road, somebody who had done it before. You can pull the string on one death and call it an accident. You cannot pull the string on all 6 and say the same thing. So what actually happened? Nobody knows for sure. And investigators have looked at a lot of possibilities. A 37-year-old convicted sex offender named Jason McCrary was arrested and convicted for the shooting death of Timberly Clater. But police looked at him for the other 5 women and found no evidence connecting him to them. His case may have been an anomaly inside the larger cluster. There's another name that keeps coming up: Neil Falls. Falls was an itinerant suspected serial killer who was shot and killed in July of 2015 by a woman in West Virginia who fought him off, his intended victim. When police searched Falls's vehicle, they found a bag containing items commonly used for abduction and concealment: handcuffs, bleach, and a shovel. He had lived in various places across the country, and vulnerable women had gone missing in a lot of those places. And here's the timing detail. The Chillicothe cluster stops abruptly in mid-2015. Neil Falls dies in July of 2015. The FBI has never publicly confirmed a link between him and the Chillicothe cases, but that timeline sits there and refuses to be ignored. There are also theories about a trafficking ring, that some of these women were being moved through the U.S. Route 23 corridor for the drug and sex trade, and that some of them stopped being useful to whoever was profiting off them. That theory is harder to prove, but it's the one many of the families believe. The truth is, we may never know if it was one predator or a small group or a network. What we do know is this: the idea that 6 women in the same town, in the same social circles, with the same demographic profile, vanished or died within 13 months by coincidence. That idea is not credible. Somebody was hunting. And 13 months of terror in that small town ended not because anyone was caught. It ended because the killings just stopped. Which means whatever was hunting in Chillicothe either died, went to prison for something unrelated, or packed up and moved to the next small town. Which brings us to now. Charlotte Trago is still missing. Wanda Lemons is still missing. Their families are still fighting to keep their names on the news, in the searchable databases, in front of anyone who might have information. Because the worst part of a case like this, worse than not knowing what happened, is watching the rest of the world decide your daughter didn't matter enough to solve. For 13 months in a small city in Appalachian, Ohio, something was walking the streets and taking women out of the world one by one. And when it stopped, nobody was ever held accountable for most of it. And whoever they were, one person or several or a network, they are almost certainly still alive somewhere. 6 women, 1 town, 13 months. Not a coincidence, not tragedy at random. A pattern that Chillicothe still has not been able to unmake, and a predator who, for whatever reason, decided it was time to stop. Portsmouth, Ohio, April 3rd, 2013. A 25-year-old mother named Megan Lancaster tells her family she's running a quick errand. She's going to be right back. She has a 9-year-old son named Reese, a boy she loves so much she had his name tattooed on her shoulder inside a pair of colorful angel wings. She has every reason in the world to come home to that little boy. 2 days later, Her car is found abandoned in the parking lot of a Rally's fast food restaurant in Portsmouth. Megan is not in it, and she's never seen again. This is the case of Megan Lancaster. And what makes it different from almost any other missing persons case in Ohio is what her family found waiting for them after she vanished. A set of color-coded notebooks that read like an indictment of some of the most powerful men in town. Let me set the scene, because to understand this case, you have to understand Portsmouth. Portsmouth sits on the Ohio River in Scioto County, right on the border with Kentucky. 100 years ago, this was a booming steel town, a shoe manufacturing town, a place where a working man could raise a family. By 2013, when Megan disappeared, that Portsmouth was long gone. What had replaced it was a town at the very epicenter of the American opioid crisis. Portsmouth was the pill mill capital of the country for a stretch, clinics on every other block prescribing OxyContin like it was aspirin, until the DEA finally started shutting them down and heroin flooded in to fill the vacuum. And when a small town gets that hollowed out, what fills the hole is not pretty. Predatory economies, people with money and influence figuring out how to use people without money and influence. A local dynamic where the same names show up on the courthouse letterhead, on the city council roster, and, allegedly, in some very dark places. That is the Portsmouth Megan Lancaster was trying to survive in. Now, here's who Megan was. Megan Nicole Lancaster was 25 years old, 5'6", 115 pounds, blonde hair, brown eyes. She had a distinctive tattoo on her right shoulder, angel wings with her son's name, Reese, written in cursive across them. She had a birthmark on her abdomen. If you saw her walking down the street, you'd probably describe her as a young mom. Before her disappearance, Megan had fallen hard into addiction. And in Portsmouth, in 2013, addiction did not stay just an addiction. It became a trap. Because the same people who were feeding the drugs into the town were also the ones running the survival economy on the other side of it. The informal, illegal, transactional world that women in Megan's situation were pushed into to keep the pills coming. Family members would later say bluntly that Megan had been forced into a highly dangerous survival economy, not chosen it, forced. But here's what her family also said, and what everybody who knew her wanted the world to hear. Megan was still Megan. She was smart. She was capable. She was trying in every way she could to claw her way back out. She loved her son more than anything on this planet. Her sister-in-law, Katie, has been very clear about this. Megan would not have left on her own. She would not have walked away from Reese. So that's who we're talking about. A young mother in a bad town, in a bad chapter, trying to survive long enough to get back to her kid. Now, here's the timeline. It is horrifyingly short. April 3rd, 2013. Megan tells her family she has to run out for a bit, just a quick errand. She gets in her car, she drives off, she never comes home. Her family, who knew her patterns better than anyone, knew immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't Megan pulling a normal disappearing act. Megan disappeared for hours sometimes, sure. But she checked in. She always eventually surfaced. When the hours turned into a day and the day turned into two, they started making calls. They started driving around. They started asking questions. April 5th, 2013. 2 days after she left. Megan's vehicle is discovered abandoned in the parking lot of a Rally's fast food restaurant in Portsmouth. Now think about that location for a second. A Rally's is not a hidden spot. It is not a quiet dead-end road at the edge of town. It is a brightly lit, highly trafficked fast food drive-thru in the middle of a commercial strip. Cars in and out constantly, employees looking out the window. It is one of the most visible spots you could possibly leave a car in Portsmouth. Megan is not in it. No note, no signs of a struggle inside, just an empty vehicle parked in a place that felt very, very deliberate. Now let's stop right there, because we need to think about what that car placement actually means. If Megan had run away to start a new life, the theory people always try first, you'd expect her car to be somewhere it made sense for her to have left it. At a bus station, at an airport lot, at a friend's house, somewhere connected to her exit plan. You do not park your car at a Rally's and vanish, you just don't. That is not how running away works. If Megan had overdosed and died in her car, she'd be in the car. That's just physics. An accidental overdose does not clean up its own crime scene, which leaves basically one option that makes any sense at all. Somebody else drove that car to that rallies. Somebody parked it in the most public, most visible, most confusing spot they could think of. And then they walked away. And that means that whoever put the car there was very deliberately putting distance between wherever Megan actually was and wherever they wanted police to start looking. That's not a runaway. That's not an accident. That's a drop. Now, for a long time, the official response to Megan's disappearance was the same script we've heard 100 times in cases like this. She was an addict. She lived a high-risk lifestyle. She probably wandered off. She probably overdosed somewhere and just hasn't turned up yet. Her family refused to accept it, and they started doing what the police wouldn't do. They started digging into Megan's own life for clues. That's when they found the notebooks. Megan had kept ledgers, color-coded, meticulously organized notebooks that documented the transactional world she had been forced into. Categories of men, names, phone numbers, money owed, men she was made to dance for, men who paid, a quiet, careful record of the whole ugly network she was moving through. And in that book, right there, in her handwriting, was the name of one of the most powerful men in Portsmouth, a defense attorney and former city councilman named Michael Marin. You need to understand who Michael Marin was in this town. He wasn't a fringe figure. He was a fixture. Former city councilman, longtime defense attorney with an office downtown. He was somebody who knew judges, cops, prosecutors, and clerks by their first names. He was, on paper, a pillar of the community. He was also, according to the state of Ohio, running a human trafficking ring. In October of 2020, 7 years after Megan disappeared, the Ohio Attorney General's Organized Crime Investigations Commission indicted Michael Marin on 18 felony counts: human trafficking, compelling illicit acts, engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity. Investigators alleged that Marin had been running a predatory operation from 2003 all the way through 2018. 15 years. And here is the terrifying part, the part that directly connects to Megan. Prosecutors alleged that Marin specifically targeted vulnerable, drug-addicted women who were facing criminal charges. He would allegedly offer these women legal representation, money, or drugs in exchange for illicit services. Sometimes, they said, he trafficked women across state lines. He was, in the state's telling, exactly the kind of predator a woman like Megan would have crossed paths with, and his name was in her notebook, in her handwriting. Now let's talk about the logic gap in the "she just wandered off" theory one more time, with everything on the table. If Megan had been just another anonymous addict who died in the shadows, why did somebody go through the trouble of driving her car across town and parking it in a rallies? Anonymous overdose victims don't get logistical support. Anonymous overdose victims don't have somebody carefully rearranging the scene. Megan wasn't anonymous. Megan had a book. Megan had names. Megan was walking around Portsmouth carrying a written record of the transactions of powerful men. That is not just a missing person. That is a liability. And in a town where the pipeline from addiction to exploitation ran through people with badges and courtroom appearances and city council seats, being a liability is dangerous. So the theory that keeps her family up at night is not complicated. Somebody in Megan's book, or somebody working for somebody in her book, decided she knew too much, and they made sure she couldn't tell anyone. Now, here's the piece that turns tragedy into fury. Because after Marin was indicted, the family finally had something. Real prosecutorial leverage, a giant investigation with the full weight of the state behind it. The kind of case that could flip co-conspirators, force confessions, unlock information about where certain missing women's bodies had ended up. And then, in November of 2021, Michael Marin died. He died before he ever stood trial. Health complications, diabetes, congestive heart failure. He was in his 70s. The clock just ran out, and with it, so did the leverage. You can't cut a deal with the deceased. You can't put a dead man on the stand and grind him until he tells you where the victims are. Everything the Lancaster family had spent almost a decade fighting to get to, just gone. So this is where the case sits today. Megan Lancaster is still missing. Her son Reese has grown up without his mother. The alleged center of the network that most likely knew what happened to her is buried. The color-coded notebooks are still, presumably, sitting somewhere in an evidence locker, listing the phone numbers of men who were still alive and still walking around Portsmouth. Her family has not stopped. Katie Lancaster has been on podcast after podcast, doing interview after interview, making sure Megan's name stays in the air. But here's the ugliest truth at the middle of this case. Megan Lancaster was not a woman who slipped through the cracks. Megan Lancaster was a woman who was actively, systematically failed. Failed by an economy that turned her addiction into leverage. Failed by an underground that turned her body into a product. Failed by a system whose most powerful players may have been the ones with the most to lose from her ever telling the truth. And failed by a clock that ran out on the one man who could have led investigators to the answer. She stepped out to run a quick errand on April 3rd, 2013. She was 25 years old. She had a son at home. She had names in a book. And in Portsmouth, Ohio, in 2013, that combination made her the most dangerous thing in the world. A young mother who had been forced to see too much. And that, in the end, may be what she was killed for. Cleveland, Ohio, May 6, 2013. The whole country stops breathing at the same time, because for the first time in nearly a decade, 3 women who had been kidnapped as teenagers walk out the front door of a house on Seymour Avenue alive. Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, Michelle Knight, held captive by a man named Ariel Castro. And in a modest working-class house on Cleveland's west side, a family named Summers watches this miracle on the news and starts sobbing because their 14-year-old daughter, Ashley, disappeared from that exact same neighborhood, literal blocks away from Castro's house, back in the summer of 2007. And after nearly 6 years of not knowing, they think this is the moment, this is the day. She's going to walk out of that house too. But when investigators tear the property apart, Ashley Summers is not inside. And to this day, nobody can tell that family where she is. This is the case of Ashley Summers, and it may be the most infuriating missing persons case in the state of Ohio. Let me set the scene. Because to understand how impossible this case is, you have to understand the specific piece of real estate we're talking about. The intersection of West 96th Street and Madison Avenue on Cleveland's west side in the summer of 2007. Working-class neighborhood, row houses close together, front porches touching front porches, kids running down the block, older folks in lawn chairs watching everything. It's the middle of a hot Ohio summer. July, sticky, humid, everybody's windows are open, everybody knows everybody's business. In neighborhoods like that, it is genuinely hard to disappear. Somebody always sees you. Somebody always notices. Except that at that exact moment, in that exact neighborhood, something monstrous was already happening. On Seymour Avenue, just blocks from where the Summers family was living, Ariel Castro had been holding Amanda Berry captive since 2003, and Gina DeJesus since 2004. 2 teenage girls kidnapped off the street in broad daylight, disappeared into a house behind boarded-up windows and tarps, and completely invisible to a neighborhood full of neighbors, for years, right there. That is the block Ashley Summers lived on. Here's who Ashley was. She was 14 years old, 5'5", about 130 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes. She was moody in the way a lot of teenagers are moody, pushing back on her mom, testing boundaries, running with an older crowd. She had a boyfriend who was 16, and she had a tattoo of a red heart on her upper right arm with her boyfriend's name inside a black ribbon. But here's the thing about Ashley you have to hold on to. She was not a kid without a family. She had a huge extended network of aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents, and she was constantly in and out of their houses. She couch-surfed between relatives. Her younger siblings adored her, and she adored them right back. She was a teenager working out who she was going to be. She was not a kid marked for a 15-year absence. Then came July 4th, 2007. The 4th of July. She was at a family pool party at her Uncle Keith Donathan's house. At some point during that day, Ashley got into a bad fight. Not with her mom, with her great-uncle, a man named Kevin Donathan. We're going to come back to Kevin Donathan. During that fight, Kevin physically grabbed Ashley's cell phone out of her hand, and he broke it, destroyed it, on the exact day that would turn out to be the last day anybody in her family ever confirmed seeing her. Just hold that in your head for a second. A 14-year-old girl, in the middle of an emotional fight on the summer holiday, in a neighborhood 2 adult predators were operating in, and an adult male member of her own family destroys her only means of calling for help. Around 6 p.m. that evening, Ashley leaves the pool party. She tells everyone she's walking over to her Aunt Christina's house. Aunt Christina lives about a 10-minute walk away. Ashley never gets there, and here is where the whole case starts crumbling under the weight of everyone's assumptions. Because Ashley bounced between relatives all the time. So when she didn't show up at Aunt Christina's, Aunt Christina figured she went back to her mom's. Her mom figured she was still at the pool party. Somebody else assumed she was staying at yet another cousin's. Nobody realized nobody had her. It took a full week for the family to piece together that Ashley was not with any of them. On July 11, 2007, Cleveland police finally get a missing persons report. A week. She had a week's head start on the police, if she was still alive to have a head start at all. Then, roughly a month later, in August of 2007, the family gets a phone call. A girl on the other end says she is Ashley, tells them she is fine, tells them not to worry, tells them she is safe, and then hangs up and never calls again. Now let's stop right there, because this is the point where every logical explanation for this case starts falling apart at the same time. Let's start with the runaway theory. Cleveland police, when they finally took the report, largely treated Ashley as a runaway. She'd had a fight with an adult in the family. She had a history of couch surfing. She had an older boyfriend. Case file, runaway, move on. Okay, let's look at that. A 14-year-old girl with no money, no cell phone, because Kevin broke it. No car, no ID, no bank account, no adult resources of any kind. How does that kid successfully vanish for nearly 2 decades? Runaways surface. They eventually apply for a job. They open a bank account. They get a driver's license. They get picked up for loitering or shoplifting or a fake ID. They log into social media. They pop up on somebody's Facebook feed. They contact a friend. They contact a sibling. Ashley did none of that. Her social security number has never been used since 2007. She has never turned up in a hospital record. She has never turned up in a court record. She has never contacted her beloved younger siblings, not once in almost 20 years. That is not a runaway pattern. That is a dead person pattern, or that is a person being controlled by somebody else. And then there's that August 2007 phone call. Because let's really think about what that call was. A girl claiming to be Ashley, calling to say she's safe and to tell the family not to worry. That is exactly the script traffickers and captors force victims to recite. It's designed to do one specific thing: get law enforcement to close the missing persons file or reclassify it as a low-priority runaway. Police in Cleveland heard that call and largely leaned into the runaway box, which is exactly what the person on the other end of that call wanted them to do. That call did not prove Ashley was okay. That call proved somebody wanted Cleveland to stop looking. Now let's talk about the elephant in the neighborhood, Ariel Castro. By 2007, Castro had been holding Amanda Berry for 4 years and Gina DeJesus for 3. He was actively hunting on the exact blocks Ashley disappeared from. His profile of victims, young, female, mid-teens walking alone, matched Ashley exactly. He drove a car. He offered rides. He operated invisibly out of a house behind a facade of ordinariness. In every way that matters on paper, Ashley Summers fit his hunting profile. When Berry, DeJesus, and Knight were rescued in May 2013, the Summers family thought this was over. Federal agents, Cleveland detectives, dogs, ground-penetrating radar. They took Castro's house apart. They excavated the yard. They interrogated Castro himself. They tore apart every property he had ever been connected to. Ashley was not there. No DNA, no physical evidence, no trace, no confession from Castro. Nothing. Now think about the size of the logic gap that opens up right there. If Ariel Castro didn't take Ashley Summers, that means there was another predator, completely unrelated to Castro, operating on the exact same blocks, at the exact same time, hunting the exact same demographic. Two monsters, same neighborhood, same summer, same profile of victim. The odds of that are astronomical. Cleveland is not that small. West 96th Street is not a hunting ground you'd expect two unconnected predators to be sharing. So either you accept that this specific West Side neighborhood in 2007 was the unluckiest patch of ground in the state of Ohio and had two active predators at once, or you have to consider that maybe Castro did have contact with Ashley and something happened before Barry, DeJesus, or Knight ever knew she was there. Something that meant she was already gone by the time investigators pulled his house apart in 2013. We do not know. Both possibilities are, frankly, horrifying. And this is the part where we have to come back to Kevin Donathan, the great uncle who broke Ashley's phone. In 2020, Kevin Donathan was convicted and sentenced to 35 years in prison for horrific and unspeakable crimes against minors. That is a matter of public record. He is a convicted child predator serving a decades-long sentence. Now, here is the piece where I have to be careful with my language and where you, the audience, have to be careful with your conclusions. Because the Cleveland police and the FBI have explicitly stated that Kevin Donathan is not currently a named suspect in Ashley's disappearance. He has never been charged in her case. That is important, and I want to say it directly on the record. But statistically, a grown man who was later convicted of those severe offenses against minors, who was in an argument with a 14-year-old family member who physically destroyed her cell phone on the last day anyone confirmed seeing her. That is the kind of coincidence that most investigators will tell you privately does not usually turn out to be a coincidence. The absence of physical evidence to charge him is not the same thing as the absence of suspicion. It is just the absence of evidence. Whether the answer is Castro or Donathan or a third stranger nobody has ever identified, an answer exists somewhere. Ashley Summers did not evaporate. She was taken by somebody, and that somebody is either dead, in prison for something else, or still walking around Cleveland. The Summers family had to survive the emotional whiplash of May 2013, the moment they thought Ashley was coming home, and the moment they realized she wasn't. They had to survive false leads. They had to survive an ATM surveillance photo out of Rhode Island in 2015 that showed a young woman who looked exactly like an age-progressed version of Ashley, only to have the FBI eventually rule that woman out. Every time hope has surfaced, it has drowned. The FBI still considers her case open. Her poster is still on their kidnapping page. She would be in her 30s now. She has a whole family, including her younger siblings, now adults, who have never stopped wanting her home. She was 14 years old. It was July 4th weekend. She had a broken phone in her pocket. She was walking to her aunt's house 10 minutes away in a neighborhood where at least one active predator was already at work. She did not make it those 10 minutes, and whichever monster reached her first, Cleveland has spent almost 20 years not being able to say his name out loud. Cleveland, Ohio, August 24th, 1951. A little after 9 o'clock at night, a traveling talent show is just wrapped up at a neighborhood park on the city's west side, and hundreds of people, kids, teenagers, moms, dads, start pouring out of Halloran Park onto the surrounding streets to walk home. It is warm, it is loud, the streets are packed, and in the middle of all those hundreds of people, a shy, cautious, deeply obedient 10-year-old girl in a striped dress named Beverly Potts starts walking the 4 blocks back to her house. She never gets there. No scream is heard. Nobody sees her taken. Not a single one of those hundreds of witnesses can later tell police anything useful about where she went. She just stops walking. And the case of Beverly Potts becomes not just an unsolved missing persons case. It becomes the case that changed how an entire American city raised its children. This is the case of Beverly Potts. And 74 years later, it is still the largest missing persons investigation in Cleveland history. Let me set the scene for you, because if you want to understand how deeply this case shook people, You have to understand the Cleveland of 1951. We are 6 years past the end of World War II. The men are home. The economy is booming. Suburbs are starting to fill up. But the Cleveland neighborhood we're talking about, the West Side, off of West 117th and Linnet, is still a classic pre-suburb, tight-knit, working-class city block. Row houses, little front lawns, wide sidewalks, kids playing kickball in the street until the streetlights come on. Families sitting on their front porches after dinner drinking iced tea. Doors are, famously, not locked at night. Not because people are naive, because they don't have to be. That's just the world they live in. And on the night of August 24th, 1951, there was one place in that neighborhood every kid in the entire zip code was going. Halloran Park was hosting a showagon, a traveling talent show sponsored by the Cleveland Press newspaper, which basically drove around the city all summer bringing free entertainment to different parks, singers, dancers, magicians, comics. For a 10-year-old kid in 1951 with no television at home, a showagon night was Christmas. Now, here's who Beverly was. Beverly Rose Potts was 10 years old, 4'11", 90 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, small scars on her arm and above her eyebrow, kidney-shaped birthmark on her left foot. But those are just the identifying details. What you really need to know about Beverly is her personality, because her personality is the entire reason this case does not add up. Beverly was shy, genuinely, quietly shy. Not the loud, running kind of 10-year-old. She was cautious. She was obedient. Detectives who worked this case in 1951 were unanimous on one point. Beverly Potts was not a child who could be lured into a stranger's car with a lollipop or a puppy story. She had an explicit, hardwired fear of strangers. Her parents had drilled it into her, and it had taken. If you were a random man on the street trying to get Beverly to come with you, she was going to say no. That was baked in. Which means, in the language of criminal investigation, that if somebody did take Beverly Potts, that somebody was probably not a stranger to her. That is going to matter in a minute. Here's the timeline. August 24th, 1951. Evening. Beverly and her best friend, a girl named Patricia Swing, walk about a quarter mile from Beverly's front porch to Halloran Park to catch the showagon. Quarter mile. That's about 4 blocks. That's nothing. That's the walk you can make with your eyes closed. They get to the park. It is packed. Every family in the neighborhood is there. Blankets on the grass, kids running around. A temporary stage set up under the summer trees. But Patricia has to be home before dark. That's her family's rule. So as the sky starts to fade, Patricia gets up and walks home. Beverly stays, because Beverly has permission from her mother to stay until the end of the show, and because that's the kind of thing you look forward to for weeks in 1951. Around 9 p.m., the show ends. The lights on the temporary stage go down, and that huge packed park suddenly starts emptying out onto the surrounding streets in every direction. Hundreds of people, kids on their fathers' shoulders, teenagers walking home in giggling packs, all of them dispersing back into the neighborhood. Beverly is last seen wandering near the stage as the crowd disperses. That's it. That's the last confirmed image of her on this earth. By 9:30 p.m., Beverly's father, Robert Potts, is standing on his porch looking down the street. She should be home by now. He starts walking the block, calling for her. By 10:30 p.m., she's still not home. Robert calls the Cleveland police, and what happens next is unlike anything the city has ever seen. Cleveland police descend on that neighborhood with everything they have. They sweep the park with flashlights all night. They knock on every door. They interview every family that had been at the showagon. By the next morning, this is a citywide story. Newspaper front page, radio bulletins, volunteers pouring in. Not a scrap of Beverly Potts is ever found. Not a shoe, not a piece of that striped dress, not a hair ribbon, not a witness who can say they saw her once the crowd started moving. Nothing. Now let's stop. Let's really look at how impossible this is. Theory 1. Always the runaway theory. Did Beverly just wander off? Get lost? Get on the wrong bus? Come on. A quarter mile from her front door, in the neighborhood she had grown up in, on streets she had walked every single day of her life, a cautious, shy, rule-following 10-year-old who was obedient enough to have permission to stay out until 9 p.m. specifically because her parents trusted her not to do anything stupid. That kid does not get lost between the park and her own house. That is a walk she could do in her sleep. She wasn't lost. She was on her way home. Something intercepted her, which brings us to the massive gaping logical impossibility at the center of this case, the crowd. When that show ended, hundreds of people were walking down the same streets Beverly would have taken. It wasn't a dark, empty park. It wasn't a lonely trail. It was a mass exodus of neighbors, all going in the same direction as her at the same time. So think about the mechanics of what happened next. In order for a predator to get Beverly, that predator had to spot her in the crowd, isolate her from the crowd, and then either grab her or convince her to leave with them, all without one single witness seeing anything. Not one of those hundreds of people saw a girl in a striped dress being pulled toward a car. Not one of them heard a scream. Not one of them saw a scuffle. Not one of them noticed anything worth noticing. That is either an incredibly, impossibly fast crime, or it is something else. Something more chilling. Because of Beverly's personality, that hardwired shyness, that fear of strangers, most investigators who worked this case eventually came to a hard conclusion. She was not physically grabbed by a stranger. She could not have been. A strange man trying to force her into a car in the middle of that crowd would have produced a scream, a struggle, a fight, something. And Beverly was not a shy, quiet victim. Once you crossed her line, she was going to yell. Which leaves one very dark possibility. Beverly was taken by somebody she knew, somebody she recognized, somebody whose car pulling up next to her did not register as danger, somebody who could say something like, "Hey, Beverly, your dad asked me to give you a ride home, hop in," and get her to nod, get in, close the door, and be gone before anyone in that crowd of hundreds ever looked twice. That's the theory that has haunted this case for 3/4 of a century. Cleveland police worked this case obsessively, and they had suspects. Not one, but several. Let me walk you through the top of that list. There was a man named William Ross Slates. He was a 25-year-old neighbor, a former serviceman, and the day after Beverly vanished, he borrowed a car and fled to Columbus. He failed a polygraph. His alibi was provided by his 17-year-old girlfriend, and it could not be independently verified. Slates fits the psychological profile, a known neighborhood face Beverly would have recognized. He died in 1978 without ever being charged. There was a man named William Henry Redmond, a carnival worker and eventually a notorious convicted predator. Redmond was working in the general area of Cleveland at the time of Beverly's disappearance and later confessed to cellmates that he was responsible. But police could never find the physical evidence to nail it down. There was Frank Dale Davis, a 47-year-old ex-convict who, 3 months after Beverly vanished, started calling the Potts family demanding a ransom. $25,000 negotiated down to $5,000. What happened next is the most cinematic sting operation you will ever hear about. On the night of the drop, instead of sending Beverly's mother to deliver the money, Cleveland police dressed a male undercover detective in her clothes. The detective took a yellow cab to the drop site on Prospect Avenue. When Davis waved a handkerchief to signal contact, the detective drew his weapon and arrested him at gunpoint. But when they broke Davis down in interrogation, he confessed to the extortion, and only the extortion. He was an opportunist trying to extort a grieving family, not the man who took the girl. There was also a drifter named Harvey Lee Rush, who confessed years later in a rambling 3-page letter. That confession was proven false. And then, a real curveball. In the year 2000, 49 years after Beverly disappeared, the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper received 2 letters, written by someone who claimed they were dying of cancer, claimed they were responsible for the loss of Beverly Potts, promised to turn themselves in on the anniversary of her disappearance. The anniversary came. Nobody turned themselves in. The author was never identified. So what actually happened to Beverly Potts? Nobody knows. And in all likelihood, nobody living now ever will. Every suspect on the original list is dead. The physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are gone. Robert and Elizabeth Potts, Beverly's parents, died decades ago, having never learned what happened to their daughter. But here's the piece of this case that outlives every suspect and every theory. When Beverly Potts disappeared, Cleveland fundamentally changed. Parents started locking their front doors at night. Kids started being told not to talk to strangers, not as a passing warning, but as a rule. The generation of Cleveland children who grew up watching their friend Beverly vanish learned permanently that the world had teeth. She was arguably the first big stranger danger case in the American Midwest. A cautious, obedient, striped-dressed 10-year-old girl walked out of a summer talent show at Halloran Park on August 24, 1951, into a crowd of hundreds of her neighbors. She was headed for a house she could see from the sidewalk. She never made it 4 blocks, and Cleveland has never locked its doors quite the same way since. Kettering, Ohio, February 7, 1999. Around 4 o'clock on a cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon, a couple out walking their own dog notices something in the doorway of a building near a suburban recreation center. It's a small Shih Tzu, wet, shivering, trembling in a puddle of its own fear, still leashed. The leash is trailing behind it in the wet grass. There is no owner in sight. 20 minutes earlier, that same couple had walked past a 9-year-old girl named Erica Baker, walking that same dog. Now the dog is alone, terrified, and huddled like it just witnessed the worst thing it has ever seen. Erica is gone, and the story of what happens next, an eventual confession, a conviction, a prison sentence, and a body that has still never been found, turns this into one of the most infuriating unsolved cases in Ohio history. This is the case of Erica Baker. Let me set the scene, because Kettering, Ohio in 1999 is not the kind of place this story should have happened. Kettering is a quiet, working-class suburb of Dayton, family-friendly, church parking lots, grocery stores, middle schools with track fields behind them. On February 7, 1999, the weather is doing that particularly Midwestern thing where it can't quite decide between rain and snow, cold, gray, dreary, wet. Not a lot of people out walking around, not a lot of foot traffic in the parks. The kind of Tuesday afternoon where most people are inside with the heat on. Erica Baker was 9 years old, 3'11", 65 pounds, blonde hair, hazel eyes. She had crooked front teeth. She had a tan-colored birthmark on her hip and a scar on the inner arch of her left foot. On the last day of her life, she was wearing a pink rain jacket over a pink Winnie the Pooh sweatshirt, blue jeans, and white tennis shoes. She was, by every account, a sweet kid. Responsible. Kind. She was the kind of 9-year-old who volunteered to take the dog out. That afternoon, Erica's father dropped her off at her mother's house around 3 p.m. Sometime shortly after that, she asked her grandmother, Pam Schmidt, if she could take Grandma's little Shih Tzu for a walk to the Kettering Recreation Complex. Just a quick loop. Grandma said yes. A few minutes later, Erica walked out of that house with the dog on the leash. That was the last time anyone in her family ever saw her. Around 3:45 p.m., a couple out walking their own dog spotted her. They saw Erica walking near a pond at the recreation complex, heading in the direction of the local middle school track. She looked fine. She was just a little girl walking a little dog. 21 minutes later, 4:06 p.m., that same couple walked back the other way, and they found Erica's grandmother's Shih Tzu huddled shivering in a doorway, alone, wet, terrified, still leashed. No Erica. Now, stop right there, because that dog is going to matter in a minute, and I want you to hold that image. By 5:15 p.m., the family was frantic. By 8:05 p.m., Kettering police were officially involved. What followed was a massive days-long search. Ground teams, dive teams, sonar, cadaver dogs, volunteers walking every square inch of the neighborhood. Neighbors were interviewed. Nothing turned up. Nothing. For months, this case went cold. And then it took an even stranger turn. Because a few months into the investigation, detectives started zeroing in on 2 people. A man named Christian Gabriel and his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Jan Franks. Both of them were battling severe substance abuse issues, and on the exact afternoon Erica vanished, they had been out with a third person shoplifting from a nearby Meijer store, trying to fund the next fix. They were driving a white van. The theory that eventually built up around them was this: they fled the store in the van, they took a route through the neighborhood that put them right in Erica's path, they struck her. And then, instead of calling 911, they panicked, put her in the van, and drove her away. For years, this was just a theory. And then, in December of 2004, 5 years after Erica disappeared, Christian Gabriel formally confessed. But his confession is, frankly, one of the strangest documents in Ohio criminal history. Because Gabriel didn't tell the story once, he told it 4 different ways. Version 1, Gabriel said a completely different man, somebody named Clifford Butts, was driving the van. He named a burial site at Huffman Dam. Police dug. Nothing was there. Gabriel recanted this version. Version 2, Gabriel said his girlfriend Jan Franks was the one driving. He named a trailer park pond as the burial site. Police searched. Nothing was there. Gabriel recanted this version too. Version 3, Gabriel finally admitted he was driving. He named Cedar Creek State Park as the burial site. Police went there with cadaver dogs, grid searches, everything. Nothing was there. Version 4, Gabriel walked all of it back. He now maintains he didn't even own the van in question, that the whole confession was a fabrication. That is not one story with some inconsistencies. That is 4 completely different stories, each with a different driver, each with a different burial site, none of which produced Erica's body. Now, one crucial piece of the puzzle had been quietly removed years earlier, because on December 30th, 2001, Jan Franks, Gabriel's girlfriend, the alleged co-conspirator, died of a drug overdose. She was gone before she could be questioned, cornered, cracked, or forced to flip on her boyfriend. The prosecution eventually had to invoke a rare legal exception just to allow her attorney to testify before a grand jury about what Jan had privately confessed to him. In February of 2005, 3 days before the statute of limitations was about to run out on this case, prosecutors finally indicted Christian Gabriel. Not for taking her life. There was no physical evidence. You cannot easily convict someone of the ultimate crime without remains. Instead, they charged him with tampering with remains and tampering with evidence. He was convicted. He served 6 years. He was released in June of 2011. He is a free man today. He has never told police where Erica Baker's body is. Now let's stop, because we need to look at how much of this story does not add up. Let's start with the burial itself. Gabriel's story, the story his conviction is built on, is that this was a panicked, accidental hit and run. He and his girlfriend were on drugs. They struck a child. They panicked. In their terror, they hid the body. Okay, let's think about that. 2 heavily intoxicated individuals, deep in the middle of a crisis, terrified out of their minds. In that state, you do not perform expert body disposal. You dig a shallow, sloppy grave. You leave forensic evidence everywhere. You panic drop the body somewhere that a jogger finds it 3 days later. But Erica's remains have never been found. Not by cadaver dogs, not by sonar, not by ground-penetrating radar, not by decades of law enforcement grid-searching every location Gabriel ever named. Not one bone, not one shoe, not one piece of that pink rain jacket. That is not what a panic burial looks like. That is what a deliberate, careful, cold disposal looks like. And that suggests either the story is wrong, or Gabriel is much more capable of concealment than a panicked driver should be. Then there's the confession itself. And this is the biggest logic gap in the case. Why does somebody confess to a crime, go to prison for 6 years, but stubbornly refuse to give up the location of the body? Think about that. Once you have already accepted the prison sentence, once you have already publicly said, "I did this," the burial site is the least of your problems. Telling the family where their daughter is might have shaved time off your sentence, might have earned you leniency, might have gotten you a deal. It absolutely would have earned you the tiny mercy of not being remembered as the man who wouldn't tell. But he didn't. He confessed, and he held that one piece of information back. Why? There are 2 possibilities, and both are dark. Possibility 1. Whatever actually happened to Erica is worse than the hit-and-run story Gabriel gave. Something so much worse that revealing the burial site would reveal a crime he can't take back. Possibility 2. He genuinely doesn't know where the body is because somebody else moved it or handled it, or he was too impaired that day to remember. In both cases, the confession the state got is not the full truth. And then there's the dog. Look at that Shih Tzu again, shivering in a doorway. 20 minutes after being with Erica, that dog didn't calmly wander off. That dog didn't run home. That dog was traumatized. And leashed dogs, when their owners get separated from them, usually do one of two things. They stay with the person or they follow the person. They don't sit in a puddle in a doorway shaking, unless something happened fast enough and violent enough to make them run. But here's the piece that opens up an even scarier possibility. If Gabriel's van hit Erica so hard that it was instantly fatal, the dog would have bolted at impact. The dog would not have made it 20 minutes across a wet parking lot to a doorway. Which means either the dog was moved with Erica, which is grim, or something else happened, something quieter, something targeted. Somebody who pulled up alongside a little girl walking a leashed dog and got her into a vehicle. The dog gets dropped. The leash trails behind it. The dog panics and finds a doorway to hide in. That is not the shape of an accidental hit and run. That is the shape of a very different crime being covered up with a hit and run story. We do not know what actually happened, and we may never know. What we do know is this: Christian Gabriel is out of prison. He has been out for almost 15 years. Jan Franks is dead. The prosecutors got him on gross mistreatment of remains, the closest thing they could to justice with what they had, 3 days before the clock ran out. And Erica Baker's family has never gotten a grave to visit. They have never gotten a funeral. They have never gotten the piece of information that the one man convicted of hiding their daughter has spent his entire life refusing to give up. Erica would be in her late 30s now. She should have finished school. She should have driven a car. She should have had a life. Instead, she is a name on a poster, a police sketch, an age progression rendering that estimates what her face might look like today. A face nobody will ever get to see. She walked out the door on a rainy Tuesday afternoon to take her grandmother's little dog for a loop around the neighborhood. She never came back. The dog did. The dog was the only witness, and the dog couldn't talk.